Spoiler warning if you haven't played Tears of the Kingdom. I suggest you finish the main scenario quests before watching this video. Tears of the Kingdom is probably one of the most fun Zelda games to date, definitely made Breath of the Wild look like a beta test in comparison. So much was done right by the developers, and I can't wait to see what's next, whether that be DLC or a new game. But while completing it, there are still so many questions left unanswered. I believe one of the biggest being, where do all three of these games fit in the timeline? I've seen plenty of theories suggesting that they fit in the adult timeline because this is the timeline where there is no Link descendant, but instead a random child named Link being the hero of this timeline. Or the child timeline because of Darmani and the Goron Elder Sun statue in Goron City, implying that the events of Majora's Mask playing out, or even the Fallen timeline because of the enemy types and the heavy inspiration from Zelda 1. But what if I told you this is a new timeline? We've seen examples of this in other media before, like in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Transformers, Pokemon, etc., where we see a new universe with what seems to be familiar characters, names, or places, but in a whole new scenario untouched by the events of what we've seen in prior iterations. We can see many similarities from essentially all, if not most, Zelda games, but that's the issue. One of the glaring anomalies are the Rito and Zoras both being current races in these games. It's not possible for the current branching timelines to have both races coexist, as the game that introduced them in the adult timeline stated that with the Great Flood, the Zoras were essentially forced to evolve and adapt into the Rito, as after the flood, the waters weren't suitable to live in. Ganondorf even mentions that there was no fishes for food, so the Zoras really couldn't survive in their current form and had to adapt to their surroundings. But let's just humour the idea that the two can be in the same world at the same time. Breath of the Wild would certainly fall at the end of any of the three timelines, and Tears of the Kingdom would ideally be after as well as at the start technically. If we do this, then more contradictions come to light, one being Rauru and Ganondorf not knowing who Link is. Rauru we could excuse. Perhaps this isn't the same Sage of Light as the one from Ocarina of Time, and as Tears of the Kingdom Rauru isn't alive, the Sage of Light's power probably needed to go to someone. That someone just so happened to be a Hylian of the same name, but that doesn't explain why Ganondorf doesn't know who Link is outside of being told by Rauru of his name. He has fought at least one Link depending on the timeline, and always knew him as the chosen hero, but in Tears of the Kingdom, it's as if it's the first time he's hearing this name and seeing the Master Sword as he's questioned if this was the sword that seals the darkness. A blade that shattered so easily against his power cannot save Link or Zelda from him, when in previous games it did. It just doesn't make sense unless this is a completely different Ganondorf than what we've come to know. This is further backed up as both royal meetings from Ocarina of Time and Tears of the Kingdom have different results. At the end of Ocarina of Time, when Link returns to his child self, he informs Zelda as what's to come, and she steps in, informing her family of Ganondorf's plans, which then results Ganondorf to be executed in the Arbiter grounds. This kicks off the events of Twilight Princess. We see something almost identical in Tears of the Kingdom, as Zelda is with Rauru and Sonia while the meeting between the Hyrulean royal family and Ganondorf, King of the Gerudo, is going on. Zelda even tells Rauru of what's to come, much like in Ocarina of Time, but instead of sending him to be executed, Rauru instead informs Zelda that he is aware of Ganondorf's ill intentions and they will monitor him for the time being. If this were to be the original timeline, then why would the Hylians, let alone the Gerudo, allow this history to repeat? It's clear history hasn't been erased, as Urbosa makes comment of Ganondorf's Tears of the Kingdom deeds in Breath of the Wild. I'm convinced that no one has forgotten what he's done, and so for Ocarina of Time to fit between these games, it just wouldn't work. Before going on to my next point, I will touch upon the fact that past Ocarina of Time, there are no current Gerudos until Breath of the Wild. So did they all go elsewhere then return to Hyrule? I'm not saying that they were all wiped out, but it's a bit odd how they all went then came back like it was nothing. Let's also not forget that these two meetings take place at different points in time. Rauru's took place as Hyrule was being conceived and he was the first king, whereas in Ocarina of Time, this is a well-established Hyrule with a royal family generations beyond the first. I've touched upon some Ocarina of Time similarities, but honestly, I think there's just as many similarities to the first game in the main timeline, Skyward Sword. One of Tears of the Kingdom's main aspects are the dragons, the Light Dragon to be specific, but this is the one I won't be talking about. Instead, I'll discuss the other three dragons that we first met in Breath of the Wild, Dinral, Farosh, and Naydra. There are a few theories going around about the dragons, how they represented the Triforce or the goddesses that created the world, but once we play Tears of the Kingdom, we get a bit more information on the dragons. One thing to note, in Breath of the Wild, it is stated that the Zonai worship the water dragon. This could have been Naydra, but their element is ice, and the devs potentially did this as they wanted all three to cause elemental damage to Link whenever he was near them, and water didn't get added until Tears of the Kingdom. So the next logical thought is to link this to the dragon Faron from Skyward Sword, as she's the ancient water dragon, but more on that in a bit. So it would seem that the three were either previously Hylians or Zonais who have eaten the sacred stones and have become immortal dragons that aimlessly traverse the skies of Hyrule. It's quite clear that the three dragons we see in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are not the same dragon guardians we see in Skyward Sword. Outside of the names being different, their behaviours are too. As previously mentioned, one set roam the skies aimlessly while the others are benevolent beings protecting the respected regions and sacred flames. Skyward Sword's dragons are also used as a main plot point to assist Link in his journey. Not to mention that Lanayru is also dead and the only way to interact with him is through time shift stones to get back to the past. I'll briefly touch on this part here as we have another similarity. Tears of the Kingdom has shown us time travel is still a thing, and the ancient race have created different types of robots, or constructs as they're called, and each type have their own job, much like the ancient robots from Skyward Sword. But that race of robots had one task, which is mining for resources and nothing more. On top of that, they were controlled by Lanayru himself in comparison to the constructs being created by the Zonai. You may ask, okay, sure, but would there be a branching timeline here, one where Zelda doesn't eat the sacred stone? Also, why don't we see the Light Dragon in Breath of the Wild if there is a current Zelda? I mean, sure, I guess, but it's very unlikely as there wouldn't be any other possible way to revive the Master Sword to its full potential and protect it up until Link gets it again. So I don't believe there is a branching choice here. As for the Light Dragon, she was high up above the clouds, which is why we couldn't see the Sky Islands too. And this isn't the first game in the series where we have two Zeldas in the same game. I was going to talk in depth about the Ooccas from Twilight Princess and their link to the Skyloft people and Loftwings from Skyward Sword here, but there's a bunch of great lore videos on this race line already, so I'll leave the minor comparisons for now, outside from mentioning that the original timeline had bird/bird Hylians from the sky, whereas the new timeline has llama people from the sky. Both are technologically advanced races who live in the sky and are essentially descendants of the gods, but if you want a headcanon that the Ooccas evolved into the new Ritos or Zonai to keep everything as one timeline, then by all means, I don't judge. One thing has stood out to me when making this video, and that is the Triforce, or lack thereof in the newer Zelda games. It's such a predominant part of the Zelda world and lore. It's the whole reason why Ganondorf himself sought out this power to rule in multiple games, but has not once chased it or made any reference to it throughout Tears of the Kingdom. Outside of it being part of the Hyrulean royal family crests, and Zelda using her light powers on Calamity Ganon where the Triforce makes a brief appearance, it just doesn't seem to exist or has such a large impact to the world as the Triforce we've come to know. Okay, now for the part that prompted this whole theory in the first place. Throughout my first playthrough, I couldn't shake the feeling that the developers were hiding something with these sage ancestors. I originally thought that they were going to use the previous champions, especially with them using their voice actors, but that's not the case. It's clear in-game that this is before their time. But who are these mysterious sages of old? After a bit of deliberation, it's quite simple. The sages are the same sages from Ocarina of Time. Well, sort of. Like I said before, there's a lot of parallels between Ocarina of Time and Skyward Sword, but that doesn't mean that they are the exact same people. It's very likely that they are the same by name, much like Rauru, the Sage of Light. Let's break down who these sages' counterparts are. Our Tears of the Kingdom sages are Rauru, the Sage of Light who lent his power to Link, Zelda, the Sage of Time, who stands in for Sonia, the original sage, who Livented, a Rito ancestor in Tulin as the Sages of Wind, a Goron ancestor in Yunobo as the Sages of Fire, a Zora and Sidon as the Sages of Water, a Gerudo and Riju as the Sages of Lightning, and Minaru as the Sage of Spirit. Looks good. Now let's fill in their counterparts. So Zelda on Zelda, Rauru on Rauru, Impa on Minaru as the Sheikah on Sages in this timeline, Darunia on the Fire Sage, Rito on the Water Sage, Naboru on the Lightning Sage since Minaru is the Spirit Sage in this game, and lastly, Kamali, the Sage of Wind. I have a separate video in the works for the sages, but trust me on this one. I know Medley was a sage in Wind Waker, but in this timeline it's Kamali. But this could be why they've hidden their faces and no names given yet. It's possible that they want to save the reveal for DLC or another Hyrule Warrior style game. With all that being said, I think one of the biggest differences we see is between the two main wars that kick things into gear. The imprisoning war between the sages and Ganondorf, and the ancient battle between the goddess Hylia and Demise. Hylia, using the Master Sword and Goddess Harp, fought Demise as he and his army came out from a fissure in the earth to steal the Triforce. Odds are he used the counterpart sword, which we don't see Demisendorf use, as he purely used gloom weapons throughout Tears of the Kingdom. Again, he hasn't even seen the Master Sword until Link and Zelda found him. We also know that after this battle, Demise sets a curse on Link and Zelda's bloodline. Eternally bound, there will always be an incarnation of his hate, like Ganon, Ganondorf, Vati, etc., who came after him. But in Tears of the Kingdom, it's Ganondorf that achieves a sort of godlike ascension, but unlike the Mice, takes on the sages rather than a goddess, and sealed away differently. He does produce Ganon, Ghost Ganon, Rehydrate Dwarf, and Dragondorf from his Calamity, Gloom, and Eating of the Sacred Stone though. You could argue that this is part of the Mice's curse, but that just isn't the case timeline-wise. We already have a defined start in Skyward Sword, but we also have one in Tears of the Kingdom. We just need to remember the symbolism of the Ouroboros. Tears of the Kingdom is the start and the end of its own timeline in 3 games. The Ganon/Ganondorf saga is done, and I'm sure they'll move on to the next villain, unless they get the Yiga to bring him back. Anyway, something Ganondorf's Zonai love child. To conclude, we see a common theme of very similar ideas being used, that much is true. But they're executed differently, or the same scenario being used is playing out differently, and for that, I believe we have now entered in a brand new Zelda timeline.